Hello, this is gaiuslibertatis, I think episode 4, and we're going to talk about Extreme Ownership, the book by Jocko Willink. I was sort of curious about this book because also in connection with my Toastmasters experience, I was interested in learning about leadership and what it consists of. And now I recently, not so recently, but a while back, I talked to Tony about the fact that he also listened to Jocko Willink's podcast. And so now we have both read the book and we're going to try to discuss it a little bit, structure it as such that it's divided into 3 parts. So the part 1 is winning the war within. It's sort of a foundational structure. And then part 2 is laws of combat. It builds upon the first part, and then part 3 it refines all the details. So Tony, welcome to the show. I'd like to start by asking you, what is it that pulled you into the Jocko Willink podcast and the experience, I suppose, and some general ideas you have about the book?
So I've been obviously listening to podcasts for a long time, and the mother of all podcasts is the Joe Rogan Experience. So that was actually one of the things that kind of influenced me to even start getting into podcasting in general with my podcast, Don't Waste Your Hate. But yeah, listening to Joe Rogan, I came across Jocko Willink. He was a guest on Joe's show several times now, I think. And the first episode that he was on with Joe, it was just a really interesting guy. And, from a libertarian perspective, it's not always easy to identify with a guy like Jocko Willink. I mean, he's a Navy SEAL, he's a warrior. And so, I mean, his whole bread and butter is war, violence. So for a libertarian, it's not the easiest connection to make, I guess. But at the same time, I think Jocko, once you listen to him on Joe Rogan, and then he did another good, actually, I think he did it with Tim Ferriss first before he went to Joe Rogan. I heard Rogan first, but I also heard his Tim Ferriss interview, and that was really good. And I think there's just his general philosophy it's all about leadership. And the book, like you said, it's called Extreme Ownership. And, I think anyone can take something from his style of leadership. I mean, he clearly is a very military oriented guy, but the great thing about the book is that like you said, it's structured in a certain way. And there's 3 main sections subdivided into further sections, all about his principles of leadership. And I would say it's useful to anyone who is either in the military for sure, but also anyone who has a job or a career, whether you run a business or whether you're a manager or you're just starting out at a job. All of these principles that he goes over in this book, they apply to, basically anyone trying to be a productive individual. So, once I heard him on Joe, I then went to listen to his podcast, just the Jocko podcast. And like I mentioned before we started recording, I've probably listened to like 60 or 70 of those episodes too. And in his podcast, he'll go over a book or go over or bring in a military guy and tell their story. And he always brings back to everything to his principle of leadership, the main principle being extreme ownership. So that's what drew me to it. I think it's a great book. I read it, finished reading it maybe about a month ago at this point, and it's a book I would recommend to pretty much anybody. So that's how I got into it.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I believe I also found him through the Joe Rogan Experience as well, and I've always been a little bit interested in military affairs, not so much because of the combat, the interventionism and all that, but I sort of think it's extra interesting to look at how the military looks at leadership, because the military is one of those organizations where, how do you put it best, where leadership is subject to the most extreme circumstances. So you have extremely low resources. You have a lot of uncertainty. You have bullets flying left and right, and you have to really come back to those principles and operate under pressure. So that's what I really found interesting about looking at military conception of leadership. And another thing I thought was it is he also is willing to show like nuance in his ideas, sort of a balance. If you think about military leadership as a sort of a layman, you might think about sort of extreme bureaucratic ownership, bureaucratic direction, and you do as you're told, and everything is just obeying and command. But he sort of explains also how you really have to build relationships and convince people to follow you, and how you have to build a culture of people who choose to follow you as choose to follow you, even if they have to follow you, they sort of unite around the same vision. That's also found very interesting. Yeah, sort of the extreme ownership is also like this is very interesting like phrase as a title, because it sort of is leadership to take ownership and then to the highest level, and that's sort of a good way of phrasing it. What do you think about what I just
Yes, so I would say it's interesting the way what you just said is a good point. He basically dispels the notion or the misconception that a lot of people are going to have, which is that in the military, you tell somebody what to do and they're just going to do it without question. And that's kind of someone who's probably never been in the military like myself, and I've never been in. I have no idea how it really works. Like you do just get this idea that people give an order and the order is carried out and that's it. But you know, in the podcast, in the book, he cites several examples where you have to do just like you have to do it in a business setting. You have to do it in the military setting, which is like you said, you have to build relationships with people. You have to build trust with people. And if they know that you're someone, you as the leader is someone who is, willing to take responsibility and willing to explain the mission and, go through all the principles that he talks about in the book, that relationship that you build is what makes you have an effective team. So, once he dispels that notion of, people just follow orders, then you really can get a good understanding of what all these principles are and why they apply across both military and business, and why they're extremely important to implement. Because along with all the examples of successful missions that he goes into in the book, there's also plenty of examples of failures, and the failures come when those relationships are not built. So, I think, yeah, like you said, it's just a very important aspect of it is that relationship building, and how it is interesting. Let me ask you a question. You mentioned Toastmasters in the beginning. I wrote it down. Before we continue on, how did Toastmasters get you into Jocko?
Yeah, it's a bit of a question. Like last April, I think April 2018, I joined Toastmasters to sort of learn how to become smoother at public speaking and so on. And then I read up. I started giving speeches and I read up more into it. And I was at first I was a little bit curious because they call themselves an organization that is centered on both communication training and leadership training. And at first it might look a bit different, because communication is like talking and leadership is more like directing things. But I found that over the months that I've been a member, I really think I started to realize that they are both really really connected to each other. You can't really lead without being able to communicate effectively. And I think Dale Carnegie or someone else also said that an eloquent speaker is sort of um, the natural leader in a group. If you can convince people effectively, you can also uh, lead people effectively. So I think sort of the influence from Toastmasters on the one hand, and the influence from Jocko Willink on the other, it really converged my interest in leadership and in understanding what leadership is and what it is about. And also, I think also as a libertarian, it's also a topic that interests me because, as you may know, the old saying is libertarian. Trying to organize libertarians is like herding cats. We're all very eager to go purity test and so on, and sort of divvy up into those little groups. And I don't know if you followed it, but like recently there was another controversy with Tom Woods and left libertarians, I think, and that's also sort of a example for me that I think libertarians and have the correct ideas, obviously, because otherwise it wouldn't be one. But sometimes I think people are not paying attention enough to really look into how do you best say it? To look into what it takes to actually get from A to B, from what practical organizing looks like. And I think leadership skills have a lot to do with that as well. And that's also what I'm interested in contributing partly through this discussion as well.
Yeah. It's interesting that you say that, because when I was thinking about this discussion, I was kind of going back and forth thinking about how if I should cover that, because I'll be honest, that is something that I have number one, I've kind of stepped away from it as far as the libertarian social media stuff. I am very, very much outside of it at the moment. I don't really participate. I don't even really comment and get involved in conversations or even observe it, and that's been a few months that I haven't really been observing it. And I see stuff. I see some Tom Woods stuff because I'm on his email list. So I am actually aware of the situation that you're talking about. And I'm glad I wasn't. I'm glad I wasn't following it, because it just gets very frustrating. And Woods, I believe, mentioned, or he's mentioned recently, that something about libertarians that is just a fact is we're clearly not winning as far as the war of ideas is concerned. We're not convincing enough people that we have the right ideas right now. We're still a minority as far as I don't know, politics and ideology is concerned. And on top of that, a lot of libertarians, one thing Wood says a lot, and I agree with, is they're not very influential in society. They're not wealthy. There's not a lot of rich libertarians like running like big billion-dollar businesses. I mean, there's a few. You got like Peter Thiel, and some others. But by and large, libertarians are not winning. It's not like all the rich capitalists, all the guys are libertarians. So I think libertarians in general would do well to actually check out the ideas of Jocko Willink, because the extreme ownership principles, I think, are something that can make libertarians more productive individuals. Because I just don't think I think what draws a lot of people to well, not just libertarianism, honestly. I think people who get drawn to socialism, people who get drawn to a lot of different political ideologies, I think for a lot of people it is kind of an excuse to not an excuse. I guess it's like you look at the ideology, and then with the ideology, like libertarianism, for example, it tells you what's wrong with society. So this is what's wrong with society. There's too much government, and it's impeding you. So it gives you something to blame as to why you're not a success. You know what I'm saying? And I think people who get into socialism, it's the same thing. Like it's a politics of envy. They're envious of the rich, and but then they blame the system. Oh, the reason that I'm not as successful as I could be is because of the way the system is set up. So between libertarians and socialists, I think there's like a similar thing there, because I do think a lot of libertarians are really just mad, and they use the fact that the state is so powerful and that our situation is what it is to basically justify or excuse where they're at in their life, in their lives, and the success that they have not had yet is because the state is in their way. And I think one thing Tom Woods talks about a lot is, hey man, there's still a lot of opportunity out there to be successful now. So even though we're not living in this libertarian utopia, you can still be a successful person. You could find freedom in an unfree world, as I think the Harry Brown book says, right? So, and I think extreme ownership, the principles in this book are something that can take libertarians who read this and try to internalize these principles and put them into action. This is how we can become, successful people. I think libertarians need to become successful businessmen and capitalists and accumulate wealth, and that's how you're able to break away from the state and the society that you want to, the society that you want to live in. It'll come into fruition more if you make it happen yourself, So.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think also sometimes when I look at some libertarian like social media pages, you sort of see a very like negative focus, like well, if you're doing these things, like if you're watching sports or something, well then you're not paying attention, or sort of a very how do I explain it best, like a very much more anti-state, and then they're really selling the story of pro-liberty and what you can do with liberty, really encouraging people to take a step forward, I suppose. And that's definitely one of those things. I think if libertarians, of course we have our internal disagreements and so on, and we should be able to talk about those. And I think it's part of the strength of libertarians as well, because other movements might not necessarily really be able to discuss those things openly and sort of critically. But one of the weaknesses, the flip side of that is one of the weaknesses that people are they're only focused on sort of attacking the state, attacking politicians, attacking things like that, and sort of building things. And I think leadership skills and really telling a compelling story and sort of practicing what you preach and sort of trying to set an example of what you think, what attitude and habits you think people should follow, what they should be building. That's definitely one of the things I think you can use to move things forward. Yeah. So I'd like to let's get into the book a little bit more detail. It's the first chapter. It is quite literally extreme ownership. So it defines sort of the concept and what is actually the ideas behind it. And first in the chapter where he talks about the combat situation, as we mentioned, the chapters are built so that he first takes a real combat story, and then he sort of applies that combat story. He takes a principle from it, and then the principle is applied to business. So the first the military story in the first part is mostly about the blue on blue. So it's like blue on blue is sort of friendly fire is another word for it, I think. And one of the, as he mentions it, it's one of the worst things that can happen as a combat leader if you shoot your own troops accidentally. And then he story goes, he looks at everyone around him and says, he tries to make a list of who can I blame and who did what wrong, and then at the end he comes to the conclusion that he is ultimately, as a leader, is ultimately responsible, and that sort of defines defines the concept of extreme ownership is that even if other people did things wrong, even if other people neglected to do their duty, you can still, you have to take more than your share of more than your share of the blame and less than your share of the credit, I suppose. So you really have to, yeah, you own everything in your world. I think that's what he says on page. Yeah, the leader must own everything in his or her world. There is no one else to blame. The leader must acknowledge mistakes and admit failures, take ownership of them, and develop a plan to win. So I was wondering what you think about that and what notes you took, and whether you take the same takeaways.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's a great start to the book. And if you didn't read the whole rest of the book and you just read this first chapter, you'd still have a pretty good idea of where he was coming from, and you could just gain something from this very first story that he goes over. And the rest of the book is basically just taking this principle and breaking it down into more specific examples. And like, there's different aspects of extreme ownership, but yeah, this is something that I think the way the story unfolds, I think there is blame to go around. All of his subordinates, all the other little actors within whatever mission this was, there's a bunch of people who made mistakes. Like, I think people didn't. One example was someone didn't update their position. They changed positions, and they didn't send everyone on the mission an update to say, oh, we moved over to this building. And I might be getting the details wrong because, like I said, I read it. It's been several weeks since I read the book. But the point is, that was just one of many mistakes that happened. And it's true. Ultimately, even though there probably was more than one person to blame, it's the leader, Jocko Willink in this case, who has to say, you know what, this is on me. I own this mistake, because if this guy didn't think to update us on his position, it means that I haven't instilled in him that this is a very important thing. This is a very important part of your job. And he goes down the line, and he shows you why he is ultimately responsible for all the mistakes that were made. And it's because he didn't clarify the procedures. He didn't clarify, the goals of the mission, and how that relates to the wider mission. And, all of that really, really comes through just in this chapter. And then the rest of the book is just kind of breaking it down further and further. For me personally, it's a thing that's affecting me right now quite a bit. I run a small business, just doing landscape work, property maintenance. So I have a small business with a small group of employees that work for me. We take care of people's properties and some commercial properties, cutting the grass and keeping the property maintained all the time. And to be honest, I've been doing it for 6 or 7 years. And I had some years where I was like, hey, I'm working really hard, but we're not really getting ahead. And once I started listening to Jocko Willink, and once I started reading this book, I started to do another thing that he talks about, which is detach. He talks about, you can't make a good decision as a leader if you are like in the thick of it all the time. Sometimes you have to detach, take a step back, and look at the situation from a bird's eye view, and figure out what's wrong. And I started to realize that I was not really being that good of a leader. I wasn't explaining to my employees exactly what their roles were in relation to the wider mission of my company. And it's a simple thing that we do, right? We just maintain properties. So it's not rocket science, but the fact is that I wasn't taking ownership of, my mission. I wasn't clear on where I wanted the company to go, the standards that I wanted these guys to uphold. and I wasn't clear on what each guy's responsibility was and what what was out of their purview. So what it ended up happening was, looking back on the past few years, I realized that, I let things fall by the wayside because I wasn't taking ownership of all of these, the mistakes that would happen. And I wasn't passing along the right information to the people who were working for me. So once I started reading this book and implementing some of these things, like I've been implementing a lot of changes in my business now that are making things way better for me, both financially and just my reputation as a business, because we're becoming a more reliable company. We're doing higher quality work. And a lot of it is just like me changing my leadership strategies based on the extreme ownership principles. So yeah, sorry, that was a long rant, but
No problem. It's very interesting to see how it works in person. And yeah, I definitely recognize this from my own experience as well, whether it's my own personal projects or group projects or something like that. It's always easy to the first instinct you have is to look outside yourself, and it must be this guy or it must be this guy, because it's kind of painful to admit when you made a mistake or when you could have done something else. And I think there's also a link in several other ideas. So, for example, Stoicism as well, where it very much focuses on what is in your control and what is not, and other people's behavior. Yeah, you can influence it, but ultimately you can try to talk to people, and you should, but ultimately your own behavior is the focus of where you should be at first trying to improve, and at first trying to see if there's anything you're doing wrong, and then you can start from there. And also, I think The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People is also a book that's been very influential in my thinking. So the first habit is indeed be proactive. So yeah, he talks about stimulus and response, and like animals and plants and so on. They have a stimulus, and then they just automatically do the same thing, and our sort of default operating mode is also often very reactive. So we see something, we feel something, we hear something, and then we immediately knee jerk into it. But the thing about being human, I suppose, is that there is room between the stimulus and the response, and there's always room for that detachment, as you say. There's room to think about, okay, this is what I have, this is what the situation is, and if I try to look at it objectively, what is the best option for me to take? Not the option that's the most convenient or that feels good, but what is actually the option that really gets the best results. And that's really the key to start improving and to start really thinking about your own potential and your own ability to lead as well. So that's very interesting. Yeah, that's very a core issue. And those three, whether you call it proactive or sphere of control or extreme ownership, that's definitely a link with each other. I think in the book he also says, it's a quote, frustrated and angry that this happened, I began gathering information. As we debriefed, it was obvious there were some serious mistakes made by many individuals, both during the planning phase and on the battlefield during execution. Then later he says, the list of mistakes was substantial. I assembled a list of everything that everyone had done wrong, but something was missing. There was some problem I hadn't identified. Then I reviewed it again, and I looked through the notes, and then it was trying to place blame, but ultimately the blame was with me. So that's sort of a quote that sort of exemplifies the concept of extreme ownership. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, and it relates back to a lot of these self-help things, like Jordan Peterson, clean your room. All this whole thing is, you hit it on the head when you said it's like you have to do what's in your sphere of control first. So you have to look inside yourself and see like what is happening and what am I doing that caused that from happening. cause that happen. And then from there, you can, when you're detached enough, you can make that plan to make a change, because it is true. People do get into reactive patterns. And the more you have a situation where you keep reacting the same way, even if you're not getting the results that you want, you get these patterns reinforce themselves. And then it becomes like just a vicious cycle. So, it is very important to do that detaching to really figure out what the problem is. Now, in that same chapter, I don't know if you want to go through a couple on a quicker pace, but the first part of the book is victory from within. So I think this is something where you focus on yourself, yourself and your own leadership skills. So there was, the first example was extreme ownership. I think the second one, if my outline is correct, is no bad teams. There are no bad teams. There are only bad leaders.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, and one of the stories that I sort of remember from my by heart, because it was quite memorable, is he talks about the boat teams in Buds. I think the training, the training camp for Navy SEALs, I suppose. And then he talks about there was one team that was very high performing and everyone was doing really well, and the other team was almost last or second to last, and so on in the boat race. And then, as an experiment, I think it was a drill sergeant or something training, someone in charge of training. He put every boat team had its own leaders, and he exchanged the leaders from the high performing team with the leaders from the low performing team, and the low performing team improved really dramatically, and they almost became first, and the leaders from the team that was high performing before, it was also still quite high performing, because there was a culture of leadership and of taking that responsibility. And that's very interesting. I think that, as he says, there's no bad teams, only bad leaders. So if there's when there's a performance issue, there's often leadership is key, and then sort of the culture of performance and the culture of taking responsibility and working hard and so on. That's key, no matter what the talents are, individual talents and so on, and surrounding circumstances. But the key element of the key aspect of leadership is that culture, and is that mindset, that unified vision that's built around the organization. That's what I took away from it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that it was one of the more memorable anecdotes that he taught. I think this chapter, we should mention that the book is not only by Jocko Willink, it's also by Leif Babin, who is his partner in their company called Echelon Front, where they do business and leadership. It's a business leadership company where they go to corporations and basically teach managers how to be better leaders. So I think Leif Babin was the one who wrote this one. And in the story, he relates not only, when they switched the leaders from the low performing group and the high performing group, and they put the leaders in the opposite groups. And then they said every race after that, it was both of those teams who are now fighting to win. So the low performing group got a lot better. The high performing group stayed good, because they already had that culture of leadership. And since they had that culture of leadership, the bad leader who came onto their team, he was able to observe how you're supposed to work together as a team and how you're supposed to lead that team, because those members of that high performing team were already in that mindset. They had that culture, like you said. And then the good leader had to go and whip a whole other group into shape. And it was pretty amazing how just changing one guy out can change the entire dynamic of a team and how they perform. So that was a great chapter. And then the next one, if you want to go over the next one, it's
just very very briefly, something interesting about the principal section. I think it's one of the first episodes, like episode 3 or something, or 6. But he mentions about face, Colonel David Hackworth, and his leadership experience in Vietnam. And what I remember from the podcast is also that he arrived with a very low performing team, and there was no discipline, and there was no everyone sort of slacking off, and then through very slow improvement. I think the Japanese concept is called kaizen, but I might be wrong. But to gradual improvement and upholding certain standards, he was able to improve a team that other leaders, they sort of thought, well, this team is hopeless. This team is always going to stay low performing. And interesting quote. It's when leaders who epitomize extreme ownership drive their teams to achieve a higher standard of performance, they must recognize that when it comes to standards as a leader, it's not what you preach, it's what you tolerate. That's very much, I think, the essence of this chapter. It's sort of, from other sources I got it as well. So it's more about what are you enabling? Are you enabling good behavior? Are you enabling bad behavior? And what are you tolerating? And how can you get people to realize that the discipline is important to apply, and as you build it, that's how you build the culture.
Yeah, absolutely. So be a good leader. That's how you have a good team. So the next chapter was clarity and belief, and basically, as a leader, in order to succeed in a particular mission, you have to clearly understand what that mission is before you're able to convince the people who are working for you to embrace the mission. So you have to understand it and believe in it clearly, and then only then are you going to be able to articulate that clarity and that belief in the mission to your team. And this is a really important aspect to success. You're not going to succeed if everyone on the team is confused about the goals or about the process that you're using to achieve the goals. Then there's not going to be that teamwork that's needed to complete the mission.
Yeah, very true. I mean, the story that comes to mind when I think, also kind of funny how you going back through the book, I sort of, these stories do sort of come flushing back into my brain. But it's about how it was mandatory for them to take along Iraqi soldiers with their SEAL teams, and those Iraqi soldiers were very poorly trained, poorly equipped, and some of them would run away, and some of them would even shoot Americans in the back as well. So there was a very low morale among the team, and if it had stayed that way, it wouldn't have worked, and there would have been sabotage of the Iraqis. And then I think Jocko wrote this one, but he said that basically you have to explain the long-term vision of why they had to train with these Iraqi soldiers. So the ultimate goal, of course, was that the Iraqi soldiers in the end had to be able to take the mission upon themselves, and they had to be able to fight themselves. Otherwise, it could be 20 years or 30 years that they had to stay there and sort of hold their hands. And then he explained the intent of the command levels above him, I mean. And that's how they sort of got he built a consensus around the idea of the mission, and that's very important. If you're not on the same level, if you're thinking that this might be the mission, but I'm going to do something else, then it can really disintegrate, especially under high pressure. And and also it's also also a link with the second habit of 7 habits is keep the end in mind. So really, Covey talks about having a mission statement, and a mission statement for yourself at first, but also eventually building a mission statement for your group, for your organization, and not just something that you hang on the wall and sort of look at once in a while, but something that really has a consensus built around it, and something that people understand and they can support, and otherwise really can't work together as an organization. Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. So I think we've been going for probably about 40 minutes already. We're almost about a third way through the book. Do you want to speed it up and get through everything, or do you want to just kind of focus on, just go through and, stop and maybe pick it up again in another conversation? What do you think?
40 minutes, you said, or then maybe chapter 4 is, we could cover chapter 4 just a little bit and then stop. I don't know what you prefer, but chapter 4 is check the ego, I think, and then part 1 is over, but I don't know what you prefer, maybe. Because if you go to if you go through the entire book, it might end up like 2 hours or something. But
perhaps let's go through the manage your ego, check the ego part, and then we can just at a more high level just talk about the last 2 parts. We won't have to get into every chapter.
Yeah. Okay. Let's try to do that. Okay. So maybe you could start. What do you remember about check the ego, and what do you take away from it most of all?
Well, I'm trying to remember. I can't remember this story that he wrote exactly for this one, but the main idea is that you allow the mission to take priority over your personal ego. You have to be willing to learn. You have to be willing to take in good ideas from others, and you have to be able to own up to your mistakes as a leader. So, and on top of that, you have to manage the members of your team. You have to manage their egos as well in order to keep everyone focused on the mission. And I think this relates back to what you were saying when you said, you in the very beginning, I think you said, you have to take ownership of the mistakes, but you don't need to take credit for the blame. You don't need to take credit for the successes. So even if things go well, you don't have to be there saying, "Oh, it was all me." Thank you. I'm the leader, so give me all the credit. No, you spread that credit to the people who work for you, and don't let your ego, essentially take over in that situation, because that's the mark of a bad leader. Someone who wants the credit. People know you're a good leader. You don't need to be recognized necessarily every time you have a successful mission. So that's kind of what I got out of it.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think the story is something about. I do remember some sort of contrast between 2 units, I think, and one. I think it was 2 Navy SEAL units, and one of them was very willing to work with other infantry units and tank units, I think, and they were sort of willing to subordinate their plan and their interest and their credits to the I think there was an infantry or regular army commander who was in charge, and the other group, it was sort of a badass self-image, and they really wanted to do everything their own way, and ultimately they couldn't cooperate well with the other unit, and so they had to sit it out, and they had to take a backseat, and they couldn't take part in the action or something. I think it went something like that, and that's definitely there's often all sorts of ego clashes, especially as an organization gets larger, and if one person can't work with the others, I have either I leave or you leave, and then later in the book, I'm not sure where, but then he actually recommends there's a business manager that has to confront these 2 clashing egos, and then ultimately the manager just fires both of them because they can't work together. So it's definitely that's one of the takeaways I took from Jack the Eagle. Like, yeah, you want to take the credit, of course, but credit is not really important as the mission is important. That's ultimately the takeaway here. Yeah.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah. So then that basically wraps up the beginning, the first part of the book, which is focused more on yourself as a leader. And then, I guess quickly, the next section is victory in combat. And there's four pieces of this.
But might it be perhaps be better to cut it into 3 episodes? You know what I mean? Like, or if you have time for it, I think that
if you want to do that, I'd be fine with that.
Okay, yeah, I think that might work because I think we're now at like 50 or something. So I have like 3 50-minute parts that might work well because then you get sort of an even approach. So let's maybe we should we can wrap it up like this. If you sort of try to in your own words start to think about what's the unifying theme, or what would you take away from this at large as a larger overall umbrella concept, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, the unifying theme, I mean, in his words, is extreme ownership, and in other people's words, it would basically be taking true responsibility is the only way to success. And I think that's what it comes down to in any organization, whether it's the military or running a landscaping business where you're cutting people's grass. I mean, it's no matter where you're at in your life, if you're trying to be a productive person and you have things you need to accomplish and you have a team that you're working with in order to accomplish that, then you need to take extreme ownership and you need to be a responsible leader. And I think that's really the main takeaway here. And it seems very simple. And anyone who's probably listening, it's like, okay, this isn't rocket science. This is very basic stuff. But there's a difference between conceptually knowing what you're supposed to do versus actually implementing it. Because I think everyone knows that in order to be a good leader, these are the qualities you need to possess. But I think there's a lot of people, even though they know it, they do not do it. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And also, the link, again, I'll come back to Link Twisted 7 Habits. He also talks about, like this first part is called Winning the War from Within. And in 7 Habits, it's called private victory and public victory. And really, leadership, it's tempting to think about sort of, well, if I'm having to lead, then other people need to do what I want, and everything needs to revolve around me, and everything needs to work up to me. But ultimately, the first step of really building a sustainable mission and vision is to first look at yourself and what is my attitude, and how am I going into this mission, and what am I doing that is a blockade. And first do not hurt, I suppose, and then try to explain a vision and try to unite people around that vision. And that, I think, is the core takeaway of this. So I'm gonna wrap it up for the first episode, and later, I'm not sure when, but we're gonna talk about chapter 2. And chapter 2 sort of more builds into the team-based structure. And I want to thank you, Tony, for coming on, and I want to thank my listeners for listening. And if you want to see and hear more, and you can subscribe on Apple Podcast, on your local podcaster, and also podcatchers, also on social media, Facebook, Twitter, as well as some alternative platforms. And you can always reach me out through there on social media, or through the email, or whatever you can find. And thank you very much for watching, and until next time.
All right. Thank you.